Hello everybody and welcome to this Data Futures Model Overview webinar. The aim of today is to give you an overview of the Data Futures model. We're going to run through all of the entities that exist in the model. We'll go into a bit more detail on some than others, but we'll run through all the entities today. The way this is going to work is I'm going to talk to you for about the first hour about the data model, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, so you'll be able to submit questions, and we will get through as many of those as we can. Just as a reminder, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before, but the model we've created is a combination of our alternative provider, our student, and our initial teacher training records. So we've taken those three records and combined them into one new data model. This is a simplified version of that model you can see in front of you. And the aim of today is to run through all of that for you. I run through some of the new concepts that might be unfamiliar to you, but also hopefully as we're going through, for those who've been involved in the collections before, you will hear a lot of fields and concepts that are familiar to you and where they fit within this new model. Before we dive straight into the model overview, we've had a few requests for a key for the data model itself and some guidance on how to look at the data model and the relationships between entities. So we're going to touch on that to start. We've picked out a couple of entities that demonstrate the different relationships that exist. So starting here looking at the course entity, you'll see on every entity in the data model the box that contains the fields is split in two. So any fields that are above the line are the primary key for that entity. So that is what uniquely identifies that entity. In this example, we've got the course entity, which is uniquely identified by the course identifier. In some entities, it's more than one field, but in this case, it's your own course ID that uniquely identifies a course. And then below the line, we have all of the other fields that make up that entity. I'll just pause and introduce myself, which I now realise, thank you to someone who's pointed out that I forgot to do. So my name's Ruth Underwood and I am a data policy and governance analyst at HESA. So thanks for reminding me about that. So like I said, you've got the primary key above the line and all other fields below the line on the data model. If we bring in a couple of other entities, we can show you how the relationship works. So a course has course subjects, and the first thing you should hopefully see on the relationship is that it is a solid line rather than a dashed line. That means that this is what we call an identifying relationship, which means that a course subject can only be identified in the context of the course it is related to. So you should see again above the line on the course subject entity that shows the primary key for that entity, the course identifier is included. So the unique identifier for the course is included in the unique identifier for the course subject, making this an identifying relationship. You'll also see, so at the bottom of that line that links the two entities, the line splits out into three. So this is what you might hear referred to as the crow's feet. It means that a course can have more than one course subject. So when the line splits out, it means there can be more than one. If you see the line just go straight, it means there can only be one. So if we bring in another example here, you've got the course delivery, and this one has a dashed line, meaning it's a non-identifying relationship. So the primary key for the course delivery entity is the course delivery identifier. So that uniquely identifies that entity on its own rather than identifying it by the course that it's associated with. So that's that difference between identifying and non-identifying relationships. What you can also see on the relationship between course and course delivery is just above that crow's feet, that splitting line, you've got a small circle. And what that means is that the entity is optional. So we'll get on to how this works for the specific entities later, but what it means is that you can return a course without any course deliveries. It is an optional relationship, whereas the course subject has a horizontal line. So a course must have at least one course subject. So that's just a bit of information about viewing the data model and the relationships. We will be publishing a key alongside the data model shortly as well. So that will give you that information about how to look at the way the relationships work. So let's dive into the model. We're going to split this out into various sections that are related to your business event. So firstly, we've got your venues, and we have curriculum data. So that includes courses, modules, and qualifications. And we've got your student data. So that's details about the characteristics of your students and also around their registration. We've then got enrollment, so this is a student committing to undertake a course session, so that provides the link between curriculum and student data. We then have module instances, so this is a student undertaking a module. We've got the leaver section, so all the information that you need to submit when a student leaves a course. And then finally, the funding and monitoring. So this relates to data that's required by your regulatory and funding bodies. So if we start then with the smallest section is venues. There's only one entity in this section. You return information about the venues where your courses and modules are delivered. This is then linked to the curriculum data and student data, so we know where those students are studying throughout their engagement. The curriculum data, there's a lot more going on here, so we'll start with the course information. A course is defined as a unique combination of subjects and accreditation. So if you have two courses, they might be similar, but they've got different subjects or different accreditations, then that is defined as two different courses. The course entity is a persistent entity over time, so it doesn't relate to a particular year or a presentation of a course. It contains certain information about a course, but doesn't exist in a specific time frame. It is the course delivery, so the next entity, that is the specific offer of that course to students, and it therefore has a specific start date, an expected end date, a mode, and so compared to the course, which is that persistent entity over time, the course delivery is a specific offer of it to students, so it has that more detailed information about the delivery of that course. So a course may have more than one course delivery running at the same time. For example, if you have a course that has a full-time and part-time version, or you have a course that has one version with a sandwich year, one version without a sandwich year, that's when you'd see one course with multiple course deliveries running at the same time. Course deliveries can then have multiple course sessions. So this describes the portion of a course studied by a student. There are some rules about how you return these. Course sessions must not be longer than a year, and they must not overlap. In the majority of cases, we'd expect the course session to represent 1 year of a course delivery. The exceptions to that would be a short final year of a course delivery. So if you had an 18-month course, for example, the first course session would be 12 months, and then the next course session would be the 6 months to make up that 18-month course delivery. So you have these three entities that divide up that level of course data. And there are some entities linking to those associated with them as well. So on the course, we've already mentioned that a course has specific course subjects. It must have at least one and no more than 5 course subjects recorded through the new HECOS coding frame. It also has associated accreditation. So those of you who worked on the Unistats return might be aware of accreditation. What we have here is a subset of the accreditation codes that are available in Unistats in order to record a couple of things. So firstly, for ITT courses, this will record whether it leads to QTS or registration with the General Teaching Council. It also records information about some clinical accreditation. So is it accredited by the Nursing and Midwifery Council, for example? And that was data that was previously collected in the reg body field on the student collection, if you're aware of that. We have a course identifier entity. This is entirely optional to return. It allows you to associate additional identifiers with a course if you wish to. So that's when you can record your own course identifiers. You can put UCAS course identifiers in here if that's helpful for you to do so. It is completely optional. That's there for providers' purposes if they want to additionally identify courses by other identifiers. And finally, we have course roles associated with a course. So this describes the regulatory and contractual roles associated with a course. You may have seen in the module there's a couple of different places where we refer to roles. We have them at course level. We also have course delivery roles and at module level as well. At the course level, this is, as I said, a contractual, it's a legal regulating level. At the course delivery role, it's those providers that are involved in the delivery of a course. So, for example, the funder or a delivery organisation that's providing teaching. Whereas at the course role level, it would be regulating bodies and main and subcontractors if that applies. So the way these entities works is you return a particular role, for example, funder, and then an associated identifier for the organization that holds that role. So it might be a funder and then the associated role is HEFKey, for example. Course delivery can also have associated initiatives. This is collecting similar data to the initiative fields we have at the moment, so particular schemes that are of interest to our statutory customers. If they apply to all students that are studying on a course delivery, they can be returned once at the course delivery level. You may have initiatives that apply to students individually, and in that case they'll be returned at a student level, and we'll mention that later. And finally, the course delivery venue. So that is when the curriculum data links back to that venue data you've already returned, and you confirm where it is that that course delivery is taking place, if applicable. If you have, for example, a distance learning course delivery, then you wouldn't need to associate it with a venue. So if we put that into an example, we're going to come back to this example throughout today. So the example we've got is just a 3-year BA in politics. So you set up your course as a BA in politics. Teacher training ID would say it's not a teacher training course. You'd set up the associated subjects. So there you've got your HECOS codes and a percentage of 100. And then you would set up the associated course deliveries. So in this example, a provider's got 2 course deliveries that start at the same time. One is a full-time version and one is a part-time version. So you'd set up 2 course deliveries with the same start date, but they'd have different modes and different expected end dates. If we look at that full-time course delivery example, you then set up your course sessions associated with it. So within the course session, you have information including start and end dates, the program year, and the location. So here we've got at the provider for the full session. And then you do the same thing for the second and third year. So those course sessions are set up. For those of you who've done returns before, what you will see is that there are fields at curriculum level that were previously collected on the instance or at student level. And these have moved to being collected associated with the curriculum data. Because in a lot of cases, this data will apply to every student studying on a particular course delivery, and therefore you only have to tell us that sort of information once, and only then return it at the student level if it's different to the curriculum that has been planned and has been returned. So that's the course data. The module data is set up in a very similar way. So you also have a module and a module delivery in the same way as you had a course and course delivery. So the concept is the same in that a module exists does not exist at a specific time, and it's a persistent entity over time that can have multiple deliveries associated with it, where that module is delivered could be over several years, depending on how long those modules run for. Modules are not directly associated with courses, because we know that providers have modules that can run for multiple courses. So there's courses and modules are set up separately and then linked together by the student data. So as with the course, you return module subjects, and at least 1 and no more than 3 module subjects must be returned for a module. And there again, we have that concept of curriculum roles. So in this case, in a module delivery role, you are referring to the provider that delivers a module. So that's the provider providing teaching. We also have a module department associated with a module delivery, and this is where you return your cost center information. So the cost centers that are associated with a particular module. And finally, as with the course data again, you've got a module delivery location. So where is that module being delivered? So the final section of curriculum data is qualifications, and the information you submit to us about your qualifications are what is the qualification, so what level is it at, what do the students achieve, what subject is that qualification in, and who is the awarding body. So if the awarding body is not yourselves, you need to let us know who is awarding that qualification. So all of that data is then it can be linked to a course delivery. So each course delivery must have an associated qualification aim. It can also be linked, and we'll get onto this later, to a qualification awarded. So when a student leaves and awarded a qualification, this links back to the qualification entity. So that entity links to both or either. So for example, if you offer a first degree and a student leaves early, you would award them an HND, for example, but you don't offer that HND as its own course delivery. That's an instance where you'd have a qualification set up for the HND, so it could be associated with a qualification awarded, a student achieving that, but it wouldn't be associated with its own course delivery because it's not a separate course that you offer. So that's all the curriculum data you submit. You tell us about all your courses, your modules, and your qualifications. And this can be submitted ahead of time. At the moment, you'll notice it's not actually linked to any specific student. It's all just planned curriculum data. So you can submit this in advance. As soon as you know that you're running particular courses or modules in particular years, you can submit this data to us. And then later, once the students begin studying on it, you can then link those students into it. So at this point, we don't have any specific student information. So that's the next section we're going to talk about. So as you do at the moment, when you submit a student to us for the first time, you need to give us quite a lot of information about that student as an individual. This is split into 4 main sections that you see on your screen. So first we have contact details. And the way this has been set up in the model is we identified that there are several different purposes and reasons that you will give us contact information for a student. So these have been combined into 2 entities. The first being the contact purpose. This tells us what the purpose is for that contact information and therefore gives context to this person address entity that you see, and that's where you give us the actual details. So whatever it might be a postcode, in some cases an email address, but that's collected in the context of the specific purpose. So the purposes we have are the home address, as you return now. Where is the student's permanent home address? You give us a country, and if that's in the UK, you also give us the postcode. We have the term time location. So again, as you do now, you let us know a postcode of students during term time and the type of accommodation that they're living in as well. And finally, NQT email. So this is a requirement for ITT students in England that achieve QTS. You provide us with an email address so that the NCTL can get in touch with them. So those are the contact details we collect. We also collect entry qualification information, and that's collected for the same purposes as we do now. So if the student's highest qualification on entry is at level 3, you'd let us know about their UK tariff bearing qualifications. And therefore you'd return entry qualification award with an associated entry qualification subject, so we can calculate their tariff scores. There is also a requirement for those of you who've completed the ITT record in the past to submit information about previous degrees for ITT students in England. So for those ones, you'll additionally have to return an ITT engagement entity for that additional information the NCTL require around when the student completed their degree, where they completed it, and what they ultimately achieved. There are also many personal identifiers that you submit to us at the moment. There's a few examples on the screen there. That's not a full list, but various things, SSNs, TRNs, ULNs. These are all collated now into one entity. So we have the person identifier entity. So you submit to us a person identifier type, that might be TRN, and then the associated identifier with that. So the coverage for each field is still specific to the field. They're just collected now within that one person identifier entity with many person identifiers within there. And finally, we have the language proficiency entity. So this is a requirement currently only for providers in Wales for Welsh students, and you let us know the ability of those Welsh students to communicate in Welsh, to monitor the number of Welsh speakers at Welsh universities. Talk a bit now about personal characteristics. Again, these are all things that you've submitted to us before, so there's a few examples of the kind of things I'm talking about: ethnicity, nationality. You've got various other personal characteristics you have to submit about your students. These have been separated out into a different entity for each characteristic. So what this allows is for you to update this information much more easily. So when you submit an update to this data, we need to know whether you are correcting that data, so correcting a mistake the first time around, or whether that is a genuine update to that data. So if a student genuinely changes their marital status, for example, if you're a Northern Irish provider. And what separating these out into different entities allows is for you to let us know, based on the valid to and from dates, whether you're correcting a previous mistake or giving us a genuine update. So those are all collected in that personal characteristics section in the model. So once you've submitted all that information about your students, within the same section, you're also giving us information about their registration. So you have that student level data, and a student will have one or more what we call an engagement. So this is a coherent engagement that a student makes with a provider aiming towards the award of qualifications or credit. So this is most similar to the concept you have at the moment of an instance. So a student's coherent engagement that they have with you aiming towards a specific qualification. So a student with most providers will have one, but if, for example, they completed an undergraduate course and then went on to complete a master's, they would then have more than one engagement with you. An engagement will have at least one student registration. So this is a binding agreement between a student and organisation for the delivery of educational services. So this is the students, the contract to educate between the student and yourselves. In the majority of cases, we'd expect an engagement would have one registration, because a lot of providers, if a student's studying on a traditional educational path, they would register once for a full course, and that might be a course over several years, but they would only be one contract to educate in that time. There might be cases where that doesn't apply, so some providers have models where a student has to separately register for every module of a course, and they have a separate contract to educate for each module. And in those cases, that's when you might see one engagement but many student registrations. I'll talk a bit now about how these are identified. So each of these entities need to be uniquely identified. So we have an identifier for each of them. So on the student entity, we have the SID, the student identifier, and this is a unique identifier for the student. The first time that a student is submitted to HESA will take this SID and create what we're calling a persistent HUSID. So this is what will then allow us to track students over multiple engagements with higher education. If a student started at provider A, HESA would assign them a persistent HUSID. If they were then to move to provider B would need to return that persistent HUSID as one of the person identifiers, so we can then track that student's engagement across HE providers. We will be publishing more information about our proposals around identifying students and tracking students soon, and we would be interested in any feedback on those proposals, so do let us know. So that's the SID. We then have on the engagement NUMHUS. This should be a familiar field to a lot of you. This only needs to be unique within a particular student. So for example, you could have multiple students all with a NumHus of 1, as long as any student that has more than one engagement has a different NumHus for each of those 2 engagements, then it's fine for them to be duplicated across students. And then on the student registration level, the NumReg. So again, this only needs to be unique within a specific engagement. So the 3 identifiers combined, the SID, the NumHus, and the NumReg, the 3 together then uniquely identify any individual student registration. So if you took the NumReg on its own, it wouldn't uniquely identify registration necessarily, but the 3 identifiers together would allow us to identify any specific registration a student has with a provider. There are a couple of other entities associated with these at this level. So we have the collaborative provision entity. So this is for those providers that have collaborative provision for doctoral research students. It allows us to identify those that are involved in sequential collaboration and allows us to track those students across providers. And student initiatives. So I mentioned this earlier, where initiative applies at course delivery level, you return it there, but there are some initiatives, of course, that apply to individual students. So when that is the case, you return that as a student initiative rather than a course delivery initiative. So if we put that in an example, just hopefully will be helpful. At the student level, you've got quite basic information about the student. You've got their name, birth date, and title. And then you've got the SID for that student. This is just an example. This student has 1 engagement, and again, there should be some familiar fields there. So you're letting us know some information about that engagement, the highest qualification on entry, the previous provider, and then you return the SID again and a NumHus for that engagement. And then that engagement has 1 registration. So hopefully, again, some familiar fields here. You've got the fee regime, start date, are they an incoming exchange student? Some examples there. And then you would return the SID again, the NumHus, and the NumReg. And you see that those 3 together, returned on the student registration, allow us to uniquely identify that individual student registration. So that is the student level data you return. You return to us those individual details about the student and then the information about their individual registration. So by this point, as I said, you've returned a lot of curriculum information, you've returned a lot of student information, but the 2 are not yet linked together. And that's where the next section comes in, so the enrollment section and what we call a student course session. This allows those students to be associated with that curriculum data by linking together the student registration and the course session. So it's linking a specific student registration with the course session that is that portion of the course that a student completes. So in the majority of cases, that will be 1 year of the course delivery. So in order to do that, we need to have those identifiers again. So there's a few identifiers on student course session. That SID, NumHus, NumReg trio needing to be returned there again, so we can identify that registration, and then the course session ID, so the 2 can be linked together. And then you have got the stu load return there as well, and you've got start date and end date in brackets there because as I mentioned earlier, the course session has its own start date and end date. So for all the students who are following the planned curriculum and doing what's expected, you wouldn't need to repeat that start and end date again. You would only need to return them where you've got students that are doing a bit different if they started late or dropped out early or took a bit longer. So the student course session itself has a few fields on it, but there's quite a lot of information that hangs off the student course session associated with a particular year of the course that a student is studying. I'll run through each of those entities now. So firstly, we have supervisor allocation. And again, this is for those doctoral research students. So for those of you who have them at the moment, you'll have completed the ref data entity and the student return. This collects the ref unit of assessment of the student supervisors and the UKPRN of the supervisors if you're part of a collaborative supervision arrangement with the proportions, so that we can monitor those units of assessment and providers that are involved in supervision of those students. Uh, there are two entities that collect fee information associated with a student course session. So we have the student fee and the student module fee. These both record the maximum fee that the student could be charged for this student course session. You only need to return one or the other, and this is dependent on how you treat your fees internally. So if you charge your fees per year, then you can return the student fee once for the full student course session. Some providers have different models where you charge your fee per module, and in that case you can return the student module fee entity multiple times depending on how many modules are included in the student course session, and then they can be associated with the relevant modules that you're charging for. So the two entities collecting something very similar, it's just the structure of the way they're collecting them that's different, and you return one or the other depending on how your fees are structured. There are three more entities I'm going to talk about associated with the student course session. Each of these all only need to be returned in cases where the student's doing something different from what you've returned in your curriculum level data. So for the majority of students, this may not be required because we can gain the information that we need at the curriculum level. But if the student's doing something a bit different, you might have to return one of these three entities. So firstly, we've got session status. This records where a student is studying on a different mode to that recorded on the course delivery. So as I mentioned earlier, the course delivery can be recorded as full-time or part-time. But if the student's doing a different mode, then you need to update that in the session status. A prime example of this will be when research students move to writing up mode, and you let us know they've moved to writing up mode, and you give us a date that they've changed to writing up mode. The next one is the study location. So we know that at a course delivery, we have a course delivery venue, and that's where that course delivery is being delivered. However, it might be that you have courses that are delivered at more than one location, or students could be taught at location A or location B, or it's split between two within the year. So in that case, you'd need to let us know in the study location entity for each student course session, where is that student. The idea being that for a lot of you, your course delivery will all be taught at one campus. So rather than making you say for every course session for each student they're at our main campus, you can say that once at the course delivery level. But for those of you who have more than one location students could be studying at for a given delivery, you'll need to let us know which student is studying where. Finally, the student accreditation aim. So I mentioned the curriculum accreditation earlier that's associated with a particular course. This is one that might not apply to many providers, but we're aware that in some cases students specialise partway through their course for a given accreditation. So one example might be if a course is accredited by the Nursing and Midwifery Council, but not for a specific type of nursing. However, after a year or so within their course, the students must specialise. So they might be accredited by the Nursing and Midwifery Council for adult nursing or mental health nursing. And that's when that would be recorded in the student accreditation aim. That allows you to confirm that students have specialised and what they've specialised to without forcing you to transfer them between different courses. So that can be recorded for those students rather than at course level. So that's the information that's associated with a student course session and the associated entities. So that's the enrolment section. We'll move on now to the module instance. This records a student's specific interaction with a module delivery and that module outcome. So in the same way that a student course session links together a course session and a student registration, The module instance links together the student course session with the module delivery. So again, it's a way of associating that student data you have with specific curriculum data. I'll run through the information that we collect here. So quite a lot of module information is collected at the curriculum level. So things like the number of credit points, the module FTE, any mobility schemes, that's collected at curriculum level. So the data on the module instance, there's not much data on the module instance itself, but we have associated entities. So we've got the off-venue activity. So this records details of a student's activity that is not at the provider or a partner's venue. So this might be a placement or a student studying abroad. It collects some details about that activity, like the duration, as well as the location of that activity. So it may record that a student studying abroad for a semester. It might record that an ITT student is on a placement in a particular school. It's that sort of information that we are collecting here. And then we also have the module outcome, and that does what it says on the tin, really. It says what is the outcome of this particular module instance. Did the student complete the module, and did they achieve the credits associated with that module? And there we also collect the module language. So that's for providers in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. You record here whether the module was completed in a Celtic language, if applicable to that module. So if we put that into an example, here you've got your student course session. It's associated with a module instance. And as I said, there's not a huge amount of information on there. You've got things like accreditation of prior learning for Welsh providers, for example. But a lot of the information about a module has already been returned with your curriculum data, which is linked back to there. So the module instance associated with the module delivery. And then once the student has completed that module instance, you would let us know the module outcome. So did they complete based on your funding council's definitions of completion, and did they achieve the credits associated? Again, we've got start date and end date in brackets there, because as with student course session, you only need to tell us the start and end date if it's different from what you collected from what the planned curriculum was, so what you returned in your curriculum data. So that is the module instance information that you return to us. Talk a bit now about the leaver information you need to return. So when a student leaves any given registration, you have to give us details of when they left, why they left, did they achieve a qualification. So information very similar to what you would return now. So leaver information is associated with the student registration. So you would return a leaver entity linked back to that specific student registration that's ended, and if applicable, also tell us what qualification was awarded to that student. So as we said earlier, this links back to that qualification entity, that curriculum data that you've already told us. You'd have a unique identifier for that qualification that would link the qualification awarded entity to the qualification entity. And again, where applicable, you would tell us if there was an associated accreditation with that qualification. So this is required to confirm whether the student did gain the accreditation that was associated with their course. So for example, they might be studying on a course that's accredited to lead to qualified teacher status if it's an ITT student, but we need to know when they leave whether that is actually something they achieved. So did they actually gain QTS on completion of their course? So if we put that into an example again, here you've got your leaver entity, you've got that SID numHUS numreg again, so we can uniquely identify the student registration that's associated with. So that does crop up, that trio of fields does crop up in a couple of places where you have to associate particular entities with the student registration so that we know which student registration we're talking about. You've then got an end date and a reason for ending the instance. So that's as you return now, you let us know when they've left and you let us know why they've left. And then an associated qualification awarded. So this would have the qual ID, so the unique identifier for that qualification, and then a result if applicable. So in our first degree example here, you might have a 2-1 or a first associated with it. Um, the final section we'll talk about today is funding and monitoring. So we've already mentioned a couple of these entities as we went through, but this is the section that allows your regulatory and funding bodies to play their role. It's data you're submitting that they need um, in order to perform their function. So it's spread out in a few different places within the model where it's required. So we'll run through where that is now and how it links back to the entities that we've already spoken about. So we have mentioned module department that's associated with the module delivery, and this is where you record that cost center information with proportions. So if there's more than one cost center associated, you would return that module department entity multiple times with a proportion of how much of that module delivery is associated with that particular cost center. There are a couple of funding and monitoring entities that are associated with the student course session. So firstly, we have the funding and monitoring entity, and for each student course session, there are a variety of fields there that are required by our statutory customers and the regulatory bodies, um, which should hopefully be familiar. So you've got things like for providers in England, it is the student ELQ, so are they studying for an equivalent or lower qualification? For ITT students in England, you've got are they studying on an NCTL allocated place? You've also got things like who's the funding body, who's the regulating body. So it's that kind of information that allows the relevant bodies to monitor your provision. And then you also have the fee invoice amount for a given student course session. So we spoke earlier about the student fee and student module fee entities. So this records so they record the maximum fee for a given student course session, whereas the fee invoice amount records the actual fee that was charged and who that was invoiced to. So it's a similar concept for those of you who do the current return to the difference between gross fee and net fee, where you have the maximum fee and then the fee actually charged. But what this fee invoice amount entity allows us to do is record the fee that was charged and who that fee was invoiced to. So it might be that it was invoiced to the student loans company, for example. So we'll know that that student received a student loan. It might be invoiced to the student themselves if they have no financial support, and then we know the students are paying those fees themselves. So what the entities that collect fees allows us to do is record the maximum fee the student pays, the fee that they actually pay, and who it is that's paying that fee. Finally, in this section, we collect information about financial support, and this can take a variety of forms. So it might be an ITT bursary, it might be disabled students allowance, and it might be your provider's own schemes. So if you offer your own bursaries or that sort of thing, there are a few entities that collect this. So I will run through those now. You've got the financial support scheme. So this records the type of scheme that's being returned. So it might, for example, say disabled students allowance. You then have that financial support offer, which is a specific offer of that financial support scheme to students. So it is a similar relationship again to what we've talked about between course and course delivery and module delivery, in that the financial support scheme is persistent over time, whereas the financial support offer is a specific offer of that to students. We then have the course delivery financial support offer. This is an optional entity. It allows you to optionally associate particular financial support offers with the course delivery that it's relevant to. So if you have particular schemes or bursaries associated with a particular delivery, then you can link that back and tie them together. And finally, the student financial support. So this is what actually links the financial support offer information you've told us about with the specific student who is in receipt of that. And that can be linked to a student course session if it applies at that level, but it can also be linked to a student registration depending on the type of scheme and how it applies. So if you had something that was based on a student's entry information, for example, it might be that that applies at student registration level, in which case you'd link it back to the registration. However, if you have some kind of yearly awards or yearly bursaries, then that may be more likely to be associated with a student course session. So it needs to be linked back to the student in one way or the other, depending on how that student financial support fits. So just to give an example to those which will hopefully be helpful. So you've got your financial support scheme at the top there, and the type equals cash. So this is the provider's own scheme where they provide cash to students. You then set up your financial support offer with a unique identifier so we can link everything together. And you can optionally also say if there are a maximum number of awards available. So say you offer 100 of these cash bursaries a year, you say maximum awards available is 100. Then, like I said, this bit's optional, but you can associate that with a particular course delivery. So in this example, you set up your course delivery financial support offer, associate it with the course delivery, and link that back to the financial support offer. So we know you've got 100 awards available to students on that course delivery. And then finally, we need to know which students ultimately received that. So you've got the student financial support entity, which will either have a student course session ID to link it to the student course session, or again that SID, NumHUS, NumReg trio in order to link it back to the student registration. And then finally the amount in some cases. So in this example, it's a provider's own cash scheme, so you would tell us the amount. There are some types where you may not know the amount. So for example, disabled students allowance, we don't require you to give us an amount that a student receives because we know you may not have that full information. So that is the funding and monitoring information. So as you can see, it is included in some different parts of the model. You've got information about fees, financial support, and some of those key fields for your regulators as well. So that is a basic overview of the model and the various entities. We'll come back to this just to finish, just to run through what we've done. So we talked about the venues that your courses are delivered at, and that you need to let us know about where those courses are delivered. You've got that curriculum data, so your courses, your modules, and your qualifications, and that is not, when it's submitted, not directly associated with any particular students at that stage. You've then got your student level information, so that's your entry qualifications, your personal characteristics, and your information about the student's registration. And then the enrollment that ties those two together. So you're linking together that planned curriculum data with the students that you've submitted via that enrollment section that allows the two to be linked. And then the module instance, which again is a way of tying together student information with curriculum information. You're associating a particular enrollment in your student course session with a particular module delivery. So you're recording a student's specific engagement with a module delivery with your planned curriculum. Then when a student leaves, you have to give us that leaver information we've talked about. So when did they leave? Why did they leave? Did they achieve a qualification? And finally, what we've just talked about with your funding and monitoring information that allows your regulators and funders to carry out their roles. So that is the run through of the entities in the model. What we're going to do now is break for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is pause for about 10 minutes. I'll put myself on mute. You should have the option on your screen to type in a question in your window. If you take that 10 minutes to submit any questions that you have, and then we'll come back online and me and my colleagues will try and answer as many of those questions as we can. So we're back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello everyone, thank you very much for all the questions you've submitted. We have changed to another mic, so I'm just going to do another quick test to make sure that you can hear me. So next to your name you should have the hands up button. If you can hear me, if you could just put your hand up, that would be great. Okay, good. I'm seeing hands going up. That is good news. I've got a couple of colleagues with me who are going to help us out with the Q&A, so I will let them introduce themselves.
So I'm Simon Robshaw.
I'm Matthew Turner in the data management team here at ESA.
I thought I'd start off, we had a couple of questions about the information on the coding manual and when things are coming, so things like guidance, quality rules, when that will be available. We do have plans to do updates to the coding manual iteratively, as we do with our coding manuals now. So things like guidance, quality rules, derived fields, these sorts of things, probably starting next year. We'll start iteratively adding that to the coding manual, and things like the questions you submit here are useful in helping us to prioritise which guidance to do first. So it will be coming. We're working on it at the moment, and we'll start releasing that towards the beginning of next year and throughout the alpha pilot and ongoing throughout until go live, really, as we keep adding to that based on what's needed.
Okay, so we've also had a few questions talking around student identifiers, specifically SID and HUSID, and how that would work. So I just thought it might be worth just giving a little bit of an overview again and a refresher of what was said earlier. So in essence, the model as it stands has defined a student. That student is actually an individual's interaction with a provider over time. So that student record is unique within that provider, and essentially the challenge we're trying to solve is both how do we maintain the integrity of that record over time, but also how do we follow students that move between different providers. So what we've done is we've kind of taken the HUSID functionality as it exists now and kind of introduced that as our intention to have a unique sort of provider level identifier. So the main identifier that providers will be concerned with is the thing that we've called SID. That is of a very similar structure to HUSID, may in fact turn out to be the same structure, substituting the HESA institution identifier for the UK PRN. And that will be the provider's mechanism for knowing which individual that they're dealing with. So we would expect to see a SID against every individual. Where we are then trying to track students over time, the first SID that an individual receives will become what we've called a persistent HUSID. So the expected behaviour is that all subsequent providers who are aware of that student would return the persistent HUSID as an identifier type against that record. Therefore we can see where else that student's been. Now clearly that still means that the responsibility of submitting that identifier sits with the sort of the second, third or whatever provider, which is as it currently is in the HUSID. What we're investigating at the minute is what services and functionality we can build into the system that assists with that. So it's given that we've got a more persistent longitudinal view of students, we should be able to offer sort of lookup services that help HESA identify where we suspect returning students might be lacking that sort of persistent identifier. So hopefully that kind of clears up the what we're trying to do with HUSID and SID. The other thing obviously is the fact that there are many unique identifiers for students that exist across different agencies, exist as different standards. So the UCAS identifiers, things like national insurance numbers and those kinds of things. The personal identifiers, which allow multiples to be submitted, multiple different identifier types to be submitted, that associates to an individual so that we can actually hold a number of different identifiers against them. So the difference is largely those identifiers are owed by agents external to HESA, whereas the SID and the HUSID are HESA's global and unique identifiers.
Great, thank you. The next question says, many of our students receive funding from the Church of England. How would we record this under the new model? So if I talk about this generally from students receiving funding from
third parties. Where it be recorded depends a bit on how they receive that funding. So if students, for example, had their tuition fees paid by another party, then that would be recorded under the fee invoice amount entity. So associated with a given student course session, you'd return a fee invoice amount, and the organisation that would link to would represent that third party. So in the coding frame for that field, we have some organisations that we know are likely to be paying fees. So we've got things like the SLC, research councils, funding bodies, that kind of thing, but also some generic valid entries, other UK public body, overseas government, that kind of thing. So if it's not one that's specified in our list, you'll have one of those generic catch-all codes that you can return associated with a particular organisation. We also have funding body associated with a student course session. So if a student's being funded by a body, however, but not through paying their fees, then that would be associated with a student course session on the funding and monitoring entity. The next question, will the slides from this presentation be available to us after? The slides will be available, and we'll also have a recording online, so you can want to share that with colleagues. You can hear our lovely voices again. So can the model accommodate hybrid fees, both charged at course level and at module level? So we've got a provider who has both. If you had different models of paying fees across different courses, I think that's what you're saying. So if you have one course that's paid at modular level and one course that's paid at yearly, then that would be acceptable to return student fee entity for some student course sessions where it applies at a year, and student module fee for other student course sessions where it applies at a modular level.
Yeah, so in essence, I think what we would expect to see one type of fee per student course session. I mean, obviously the model allows both. I think there's some nuance that probably will get fleshed out through the guidance conversations later on. I mean, the challenge we would have is if we received a student course session fee and a series of modular fees, it's actually trying to understand what behaviour we would need to perform on that. So would we need to aggregate all of the modular fees and compare it to the student course session? Are they separately? And there's a series of implications for validation and other behaviours. So it's expected that we would see one or the other for a particular student course session. Now, obviously, that's a conversation that we can have as part of the continued alpha development. If people believe that there might be issues or problems in that approach.
We've had a question around students not achieving the qualification that's associated with the course. So if they've studied on a course delivery but achieved a lower qualification for whatever reason, and how that would be treated. So each course delivery is associated with a qualification and therefore has that specific qualification aim. Where a student doesn't achieve that aim and they're awarded a lower qualification, then you would return the qualification awarded entity for that student representing that lower qualification. What you wouldn't have to do, which I think is what this question is getting at, is then associate that lower qualification with the course delivery. So each course delivery only has one aim. If students achieve something slightly different, that doesn't change the aim of the course delivery, it changes what the students achieved. So the course delivery aim remains the same, it's just that the students have achieved something a little different.
Yeah, so really, I mean, what functionality that's providing there is the ability to understand where students aren't actually achieving what the course principal aim of the course actually is. So,
We have a question about the valid to and from dates on personal characteristics and whether this records the date the change actually took place or the change was recorded in your systems. I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, this is the date it was recorded in your systems. The main purpose of the dates is not to record the specific date, you know, someone got got married and their marital status changed. It's more about, as I spoke about earlier, understanding whether the update that's being made is a correction or an update, and therefore it's not a requirement that we know the specific date on which one of those characteristics specifically changed.
Yeah, so I think, and again, this is the kind of thing that we will be very clear about when we're putting the guidance out of exactly what these dates represent. So what it isn't is it's not a transaction date that effectively the system process, HESA systems process. It's not a timestamp, of the time that HESA became aware of this. That will happen as part of the actual consumption of the file. What it's kind of trying to represent is the point at which the provider became aware of it. So that may, in certain circumstances, actually need to be the date it took effect, and it may, in other circumstances, just be the date you became aware of it. So if there is any variance, we'll be absolutely explicit about that within the guidance, but the general principle is it is the point the provider became aware.
We've had a question about software suppliers, an update from them on how they'll manage the changes. Without speaking on their behalf, I'd say we've had a couple of workshops over the past month with our software suppliers, so that we can get them in and discuss the changes, both in terms of the model and the processes and the way that they've changed. So we're engaging with the software suppliers regularly and speaking with them. I'm not sure what we can give in terms of response on how they'll be managing the change, or is there much we can say on that other than that we're engaging with them and keeping them involved in the process.
Yeah, and it is probably worth just making the assertion that HESA can't kind of directly involve itself in kind of contractual relationships between providers and the software houses themselves. Obviously, we're doing everything we can to provide the information that the software houses will need in order to prepare. Obviously, it would be beneficial if providers who have some concerns over software houses' readiness kind of raise that to both us and to the software houses directly as well. We're all trying to get to the same place, but HESA does have to be kind of careful that it's not sort of directly positioning itself between or in the middle of a contractual relationship between providers and their software suppliers.
Okay, we've had a question, can course deliveries be accredited? Someone's got some sandwich versions of a course that are accredited, but the non-sandwich versions are not accredited. I'm afraid course deliveries can't be accredited. The accreditation sits at course level, so the definition of the course is that unique combination of subjects and accreditation. So if you have a situation where the sandwich version is accredited but the non-sandwich version is not, that would need to be two separate courses rather than two separate course deliveries. So we've had a question from an alternative provider about some of the fields that are unfamiliar, some of the new fields in there that might not be as familiar to alternative providers as our HEIs, and will there be guidance available online? So as I mentioned, we will have guidance being added iteratively to help you with gaining understanding of those new fields and requirements. As always, liaison team are there if you have any specific questions that you'd like to talk through, and we'll be adding that guidance as we go to try and help you as best we can in understanding that. Please can you clarify what is meant by venues? Is it campus locations or does it apply to a specific building within a campus? It's not a specific building. We won't be, as I understand, requiring you to we won't, as I understand, be requiring you to submit a specific building within a campus. It's worth flagging that for alternative providers with designated locations, the venues you return will need to align with the designated locations agreed with HEFKey, and therefore if I'm not familiar with all your arrangements and your designation, but in some cases that might mean that designation applies to a more specific location or a broader location, but for alternative providers you need to make sure your venues are aligning with that those designated locations that are agreed with HEFKey. Just having a look through your questions here. So around what course sessions will need to be returned, particularly in the 1920 year. So you'll have some new students beginning on course deliveries. You'll also have continuing students, for example, in the second and third year of your 3-year course, and where you need to return the course deliveries and course sessions for each of these. The answer is yes. For any students that are on particular curriculum, you'll need to have the curriculum data returned associated with that. So if you've got continuing students that you'll be returning in 1920, you'll need to make sure the curriculum data's there for them to be linked to and associated with. It might be worth saying that with the curriculum data, I mentioned that you can return it in advance. So if you have that data ready for a couple of years down the line, you can return it, but it's not a requirement to return it until students are associated with it. So if it, depending on your systems and the way you're set up, it might be easier for you to wait until they're live, if you like. So a course session actually has students studying on it and is current to submit it. So in the first year, you could just submit the course sessions for year 1 of a particular course and then not submit the subsequent ones until they become relevant. It's dependent on your systems and how that works.
Yeah, so we've had a question here about contact details and around address types and graduates. Now, so originally in the scope of the DLSG logical model, which is kind of the progenitor for the collection specification, that covered student curriculum data, which also covered leavers. So the underlying model was applicable to graduate information. I think where we've got to in the specification now is that it isn't expected that the graduate contact details would be collected through this. However, obviously, with the graduate outcomes review, there are going to be hard dependencies between the Data Futures platform and graduate outcomes. So I think it was principally, and not being completely au fait with the conversations that have taken place in this area recently, I think the expectation is that we wouldn't be collecting graduate contact details through this collection.
We've had a couple of questions around modules and requirements on module data, so I'll try and cover some of those off together. If a student changed modules within a year, how would this be recorded? So if a student begins studying on one module and then switches to another, you'd have one module instance associating the student course session with a module delivery, and that would then be closed down with an end date, and then a new module instance would appear associating the student with a new course delivery, so module delivery, sorry. So there is some work we need to do around guidance around the expected behaviour around that, and what's, I suppose, reasonable for you to return if a student studies on a module for one day. Is it reasonable to make you return both? So that's something that we need to have conversations around, and will come through the guidance.
Yeah, so I mean, just to give a little bit of context of that, because that kind of what changes a relevant question, I think, is quite pertinent to large parts of the model. Just for a bit of history on that is in moving to an in-cycle data collection, what we've done is we've built a data model that's much more transactional. So it's actually the events within the providers that trigger creation of the data itself. So what that means really is by default the system is interested in any changes that happen. Now, what we're keen to avoid, and I think where the balance of this question lies, is how much of that is actually just providers' administrative, kind of behaviour and driven by internal business processes, versus how much of that is actually, student type behaviour that might be interesting to sort of the regulators and onward users of the data. So whilst we haven't got a clear answer yet, that will come through continued discussions and be clear in guidance, as I've said previously. the system is designed to capture those genuine sort of transactional events. It is a case of materiality, and I suspect if a student has registered an interest for a module and never actually goes on to study that module, they formally change their module diet, but having not actually commenced it, sort of preliminary mark of interest, as it were. And I can't see that that's actually going to be of interest, and that we wouldn't want to be capturing that information. So I guess what this means is actually this is where the decision within the providers is still going to be one of what information needs to be put into the staging area and therefore transferred across to HESA. As I say, we will be clear as we can with the guidance, and we're fully aware of the sort of the nuances around that issue, but we don't have a clear answer yet, but we are working on it.
Another thing to say on module, that module outcome is required for module instances. Where there's been a module instance, you need to let us know whether the student has completed that. It's current requirement in the HESA student return that's been transferred over to the data futures model. We've had a question about the equivalent of course aim in the new model. Each course delivery is associated with a qualification entity, and on that qualification entity is a qualification label, so that will indicate the aim of any given course delivery in a similar way to course aim now. It's associated with the course delivery rather than now course aim on the course entity.
So there's another follow-on question from Sid around how we find out about the previous SID. So again, I suspect that there are obvious candidate students that are likely to, as much as there are with USIDs now. So there's a question around whether that information is captured within the sort of enrolment registration process. As I say, HESA intends to provide lookup services and other potential reports or markers to assist in identifying those students and what their SIDs and persistent usage should be. I mean, ultimately, and as the position is now, it's up to the provider to find out that they identify and return it. If it's not returned, fundamentally it doesn't break how the system works. What it does do is it makes the longitudinal or sector level view of the data set slightly less robust. So it's a valuable piece of information to have, and we will try and work with you as best as we can to make sure that it's easy for you to do that.
Just having another quick look through your questions. We've had someone ask when the recording will be available. I'm not sure if we have a turnaround time on that. It should be available next week, I'm being told. So that should, if you want to circulate that to colleagues or anything, we should have that available next week. We've had a question. This is the first time we are aware of student support as opposed to tuition fee funding would be recorded here. We understood correctly, is that that may be, and apologies if I've misunderstood, is this in relation to the student financial support schemes, student financial support offer entities that collects a variety of different student supports, all of which are in the current student collection in one way or another. So you've got the ITT bursaries, the disabled students allowance, and what was previously the financial support entity required for providers in England that collected data for offer. So student support in those forms is collected through those financial support scheme, financial support offer entities that we spoke about earlier. And then, as you say, support for tuition fees recorded through the fee invoice amount entity. Will we be required to submit module enrolments as well as module results as separate entities? So the way it's set up in the module is you've got the module instance, so that is the student signing up to the module delivery, and then the module outcome is a separate entity. So what that allows you to do is submit the module instance information when a student starts a module, and then once they complete, you then additionally submit that module outcome to indicate that they've completed.
Yeah, so in effect that's kind of a recognition of the timings, the reality of students studying module, because it's an in-cycle system. It means that it's perfectly possible to kind of identify when students are committed and are studying modules, but in advance of them having completed the study. So what we're trying to avoid in that instance is either delaying submission of modular information until module completion, or having to resubmit the same data multiple times to provide updates to it. So there's a couple of questions as well around apprenticeship information, which I can try and answer, although I suspect what we need to do is come out with some more clarification, just for the avoidance of doubt. But for degree apprenticeships, my understanding is that the degree element of the degree apprenticeship is within scope of this model, because it's within the coverage of HESA's collections. We'll need some mechanism of identifying the fact that it's a degree apprenticeship, but I believe that as it stands, the actual apprenticeship element is not contained within the scope of the model. That goes for kind of general FE and apprenticeship information as well. As it stands, it's not within the scope of this specification.
Yeah. So as is at the moment, the general coverage of the student record, if a student's doing a higher or degree apprenticeship, so if they're studying at HE level qualification with you, then that falls within the general coverage of the student record, and it would be identified through an initiative that student was studying on an apprenticeship. But that, as Simon said, all those additional fields that we have in the current collection are not appearing in the model. So it's coming up to past, so I think we will draw it to a close there. Thank you very much to everyone submitted questions. Apologies to those, there are a couple that we didn't get to, but we will use those, as I said, to inform guidance and things going forward, and we'll hopefully be able to there's only a couple, so we should be able to follow up with you afterwards for those questions that we didn't manage to get to. Thanks very much for joining us. As I said, the liaison team are always there. You can get in touch with liaison@hesa.ac.uk with any questions that come up going forward. And thanks very much again for joining us. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.